It was 1979, somewhere in the forested ranges of New South Wales, when a trained reptile expert climbed back into his vehicle, turned the key, and watched what he had taken for a fallen log suddenly rise up on 4 legs and run. It was not a small goanna. It was a lizard far larger than anything that should still be living in those hills. Because the animal he was describing already had a name: Megalania, the largest land lizard the world has ever known. And here is the part that keeps people up at night. According to every fossil we have ever pulled out of the ground, this animal vanished around 50,000 years ago. So, either a respected scientist mistook a tree for a monster in broad daylight, or something the Ice Age was supposed to have buried is still out there, moving through the bush. To understand why a single sighting could cause this much trouble, you have to understand what Megalania actually was. Picture Australia tens of thousands of years ago. The continent was a world of giants. Wombats the size of cars, kangaroos taller than any man, flightless birds heavier than an ostrich. And moving among them, the apex of them all, a monitor lizard built like a living tank. If you have ever seen a Komodo dragon, you already have a head start. Megalania looked like its enormous cousin. It had the same low, muscular body, the same flicking forked tongue, and the same heavy, swinging gait. But the Komodo dragon grows to around 3 meters. Megalania was on another level entirely. But this is where we have to be honest with you, because the size is genuinely contested. We have never found a complete Megalania skeleton. Not a single one. What we have are scattered bones, vertebrae, teeth, pieces of jaw. So scientists have had to estimate, and they have argued about it for over a century. The conservative estimates put the largest individuals at around 4.5 meters. Other studies push that figure up toward 5.5 meters, and the oldest estimates of all reached as high as 7 meters, roughly the length of a saltwater crocodile. The weight is just as uncertain. Depending on which study you trust, a big one tipped the scales somewhere between 300 and around 575 kilograms. So somewhere between a very large lion and a small horse in the body of a lizard. That is the animal we are talking about. The first time the wider world even learned it existed was back in 1859, when the British naturalist Richard Owen examined 3 strange, oversized vertebrae sent from the Darling Downs in Queensland. Owen gave it the name Megalania. He intended it to mean Great Roamer. Although thanks to a quirk of Latin, it has often been mistranslated over the years into something far more sinister sounding: the ancient giant butcher. But a name on a label tells you almost nothing about what it was like to share a landscape with this thing. So let us put it back into its world. But before we do that, if you're liking this video so far, subscribe to follow along. Megalania was an ambush hunter. Everything about its body points the same way: heavy limbs, a muscular tail, and a long skull lined with curved, blade-like teeth designed to grip and tear. The picture most scientists paint is of a patient killer. It would lie still, blended into scrub and shadow, and wait. And when something large wandered too close, it struck. But here is the detail that turns Megalania from impressive into nightmarish. It may have been venomous. Its closest living relatives, including the Komodo dragon, belong to a group of lizards that produce venom. Research has suggested that a bite from one of these animals does not just wound. It delivers compounds that stop blood from clotting and send prey into shock. Now scale that up to an animal the size of a crocodile. If Megalania really did carry venom, it would be the largest venomous animal with a backbone that we know ever existed. One bite and its prey might not even need to be chased. It just had to be followed while the wound did its work. Sit with that for a moment. The largest venomous animal alive today is a snake you could lift with 2 hands. Megalania, if the science holds, would have carried that same chemistry in a body heavier than you and your friends combined. And it had plenty to hunt. This was a buffet of giants. First there was Diprotodon, a marsupial the size of a rhinoceros. Then there were short-faced kangaroos far heavier than any alive today. There also was a so-called marsupial lion, a flesh-eater with one of the strongest bites of any mammal of its size. There were giant flightless birds and even a land-dwelling crocodile prowling the same ground. This was the caste Megalania lived alongside, and being the biggest predator in that lineup tells you something. For a long stretch of time, almost nothing on the continent could challenge it. So how do you kill something like that? How does the undisputed apex predator of an entire continent simply disappear? Because that is exactly what the fossils say happened next. The youngest Megalania remains we can confidently date are from around 50,000 years ago. After that, in the fossil record, the giant lizard goes quiet. And that timing is the whole story, because right around that same window, something new arrived on the continent. People. The first Aboriginal Australians reached this land roughly 50,000 years ago. And almost everywhere humans turned up across the planet, the largest animals tended to disappear soon after. Australia was no exception. So what actually happened to Megalania? The honest answer is that we are not certain. But scientists have a few leading ideas, and they are not mutually exclusive. The first is direct pressure. As humans hunted the great plant eaters of Australia, the giant herbivores Megalania depended on for food began to vanish. Take away the prey, and you take away the predator. The second is the land itself. Early people reshaped the continent with fire, opening up dense vegetation into more open country. For an ambush hunter that needed cover to survive, losing the places to hide in could have been fatal. And there is a third, almost quiet observation that researchers have made. One study modelled the muscle and the build of Megalania and concluded that, for all its size, it was probably not fast. Likely too slow to ever outrun the humans now walking its territory. A slow giant in a shrinking world surrounded for the first time by something cleverer than itself. You can see how the story ends. But notice the word we keep using. Around. Around 50,000 years ago, the fossil record is not a calendar. It only tells us the last time an animal happened to die somewhere its bones could survive and be found. The real last Megalania could have lived long after that, in a place that left us nothing. And Australia, even today, is one of the emptiest, least explored places a large animal could possibly hide, which is exactly the gap that a handful of people have spent their lives trying to fill. This is where the story leaves the museum and walks out into the scrub, because if you ask the people who live closest to the wild parts of Australia, some of them will tell you the giant lizard never left. The name that comes up most often is Rex Gilroy, an Australian researcher who spent decades collecting reports of a creature he was convinced was a surviving Megalania. Gilroy gathered accounts going back generations. One of the oldest he pointed to came from a town in Victoria called Euroa, where, by his telling, residents in the 1890s described a huge reptile raiding farms and killing livestock before retreating into the bush. But the cases that drew the most attention came much later. In 1979, Gilroy said he was called out to a freshly ploughed field where a farmer had found a line of enormous tracks. Rain had destroyed most of them, but Gilroy claimed he managed to take a plaster cast of one surviving print, a footprint he believed matched a giant monitor lizard. And nearly 30 years later, he reported finding strikingly similar tracks again on a forest trail roughly 300 kilometers away. And then there is the sighting we opened this video with. The reptile expert in the ranges of New South Wales who watched a log stand up and run. That account stuck because of who reported it. This was not a frightened tourist. By the accounts that circulate, it was a herpetologist, someone who handles and studies reptiles for a living, describing an animal that dwarfed anything in the textbooks. And the reports are not all from one corner of the country. Similar stories trickle in from across eastern Australia, from the tropical north, and even from across the water in New Guinea, where another account describes a vast lizard sunning itself on a fallen tree. There is also something older underneath all of this. Across the continent, Aboriginal cultures hold deep traditions about giant goannas, including immense reptilian figures woven through the dreaming. To the people who believe Megalania survives, this all fits a pattern. A vast, wild land. Generations of witnesses, footprints, and folk memory of an enormous lizard. They will point out that we have been wrong before, that the gorilla itself was once dismissed by Western science as a native myth, right up until one was finally brought in. It is a compelling case. It is also, when you look closely, a case built almost entirely on one kind of evidence: stories. And the trouble with stories is that they are exactly what you would expect to find whether the animal is real or not. So, before we decide, we have to do the hard thing and turn the same skeptical eye on the believers that they turn on the skeptics. And that is the problem. Because for everything in that pile of reports, there is one thing it does not contain: a body. There is no carcass, no fresh bone, and not a single tooth from the last few thousand years. There are no clear photographs and no footage that survives scrutiny. After more than a century of claims, the physical evidence for a living Megalania is plaster casts and eyewitness memory. And memory in the bush at a distance is a famously unreliable witness. Australia does have very large monitor lizards alive today. The parenti can reach around 2.5 meters. In poor light, at a bad angle, with adrenaline running, a big parenti rearing up and bolting away could absolutely look like a monster to a startled observer. Scale is one of the first things the human eye gets wrong. Then there is the deeper problem, the one paleontologists keep returning to. A predator the size of Megalania could not survive as a single hidden animal. To exist at all, it would need a breeding population, many individuals eating constantly, leaving kills, droppings, tracks, and eventually bodies for generation after generation. Hiding one giant lizard is hard. Hiding enough of them to keep the species alive for 50,000 years, with nothing ever turning up, is something else entirely. And critics point to one timing detail that is hard to ignore. The wave of sightings did not really begin until after 1859, after Owen described the creature and the idea of a giant Australian lizard entered the public imagination. People tend to see what they have been given a shape for. So where does that leave us? By every standard that science recognizes, Megalania is extinct and has been for tens of thousands of years. The evidence for a survivor does not hold up. But notice what we still cannot honestly say. We cannot say we have searched every valley and every range. We cannot say we know the exact year the last one died. The fossil record gave us an around, and the continent is more than big enough to keep a secret. Megalania is gone. The bones say so, the logic says so, and the lack of a single carcass in over a century says so loudest of all. And yet, when the sun drops behind the ranges and the bush goes still, it is worth remembering that this animal was real. A venom-jawed lizard the length of a car once owned this land, completely. It is not a myth, it is history. The mystery is not whether it ever existed. The mystery is exactly when the very last one closed its eyes in some forgotten corner of a continent we still have not finished exploring. If you want to keep standing at the edge of what we know and what we have lost, subscribe and come with us. There are more giants in the dark, and we are going looking for them.